Are men the victims or the villains? Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. I want to talk a little bit about the victim-villain mentality. And I'm primarily going to speak about this in terms of men and masculinity, or masculine energy. As I've mentioned in other videos, my primary reason for talking about masculine energy and masculinity is not to teach men how to be masculine, because I have accepted the fact that most men are going to want a male leader in order to lead them into their masculinity, and historically speaking that has been the ideal way to do it. So I don't necessarily intend to teach men how to be masculine or guide men into their masculinity. The primary reason that I talk about masculinity and masculine energy is because I want to speak to women, and I want women to know what true masculine energy is so they know what to look for, and they also know that masculinity is not a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing when it's in a healthy form. And the more informed women can be about how to spot healthy masculine energy, the better they're going to be at choosing a partner and having loving, healthy relationships. So that's primarily the reason why I talk about masculine energy and masculinity. I've actually noticed a big trend, and I feel like it's getting worse and worse. It's been brewing for a while, but it's been getting worse and worse, of men fighting so hard to be the victims. It's so overwhelming sometimes how many times I can, either if I speak on something or I hear another woman speak on something, and the ability that so many men seem to have today to make themselves into the victim of a situation that in many cases doesn't even involve them. It's kind of overpowering at times to see this obsession that young men have with trying to convince everybody that they are the victims. There's entire social media accounts, I won't name names because I don't want to give anybody any more attention than they already have, but there's entire social media empires of people who are making a lot of money and very successful, teaching young boys and young men that they are the victims of things. They're the victims of society, that, you know, women are the bad guys and everyone's a bad guy, but the man is the victim. Now, I realize I'm a woman, last I checked. I realize that a lot of men are gonna say, well, what right do you have to tell men how to be masculine? I don't pull my beliefs and theories and ideas about masculine energy and masculinity out of thin air. I don't just make this stuff up. I'm not like, oh gee, I think a man should do this, so I'm just gonna tell men that they should all be like this. I talk about this stuff from years of studying people who have studied masculinity and masculine energy, whether they be, you know, people that talk about it from a psychological perspective, people that talk about it from a spiritual perspective, mostly from men. And I know there's a lot of men out there who are going to make the argument that you can't just read about masculinity or masculine energy from a book. However, most cultures have believed that men do not become masculine on their own. They need to be initiated into their masculinity by masculine leaders. If that is the case, then masculinity is absolutely a skill that you can learn about and you can study. And even as a woman, while I may not be in a man's body, I am able to study the theories behind it and understand it enough to be able to talk about it in an intelligent way. And when I do film breakdowns where I talk about masculine and feminine energies, I'm showing examples of films where the established masculine hero or the established masculine man has qualities that universally many of us have agreed upon are representative of the masculine, of masculine energy. Many of these stories that were originally written by men, were originally produced by men. I'm simply breaking them down and interpreting them. So when I talk about masculine energy and masculinity, I'm not just making this stuff up. I'm not just like, hey, I'm a woman, I want to tell men what to do, and I want them to be exactly what I want them to be, so I'm just going to boss them around. I'm simply sharing things that have historically and universally been seen as being masculine or being representative of masculinity, because in reality, these are things that have benefited society. These have been the qualities that men have needed to have historically in order to become leaders, in order to lead a society, in order to be productive members of a society, a tribe, a group of people. I've been noticing this trend that's been happening where a lot of men, particularly on social media, and I don't want to say this is all men, but I have been noticing a large trend of men on social media who are almost addicted to portraying themselves as the victim, or almost addicted to feeling like they need to be the victim of every single situation. I'm not saying that women don't have victimhood mentalities. Women do. They absolutely do. But in this particular case, I want to talk about it in terms of men and masculinity, because it relates to a lot of the film breakdowns that I talk about here on my channel. So just put a pin in the women and victimhood, and I probably will do a separate video talking about women and victimhood, but I just want to talk about the masculine perspective of victimhood. Victimhood does tend to be a wounded feminine mentality, which will show up a little bit differently when it's wounded feminine in a woman than when it's wounded feminine in a man, but either men or women can be in wounded feminine energy. You are in wounded feminine energy, which means you're in your victimhood. You cannot be connected to your masculine energy. So if you're a man, you're connected to your victimhood, you cannot be in your masculine. You're just not. Like, you're not fully connected to your masculine energy. And I find it interesting that I'm noticing this trend. I've noticed this too, anytime that I seem to call out men for any kind of behavior, it becomes this, first of all, they have to deflect responsibility and accountability onto women, which if you as a man want to be a masculine leader, responsibility and accountability is on you. And the act of deflecting that accountability and responsibility is the act of actually not taking it for yourself. So what you're doing when you do that as a man is expecting women to be more responsible and accountable than you are as a man. And I'm not going to get into that whole battle because that's just a battle that goes nowhere. But at the end of the day, that's one of the ways that this shows up, is men constantly deflecting on women and wanting women to say that they're the bad guys and men wanting to say that they're the victims. I say this because I would like to see men more empowered. And I know there's a lot of men who are going to get defensive about this. But I want to say that I do sympathize with a lot of these men that are sinking into this victimhood, because for one, the media and a lot of powerful people are trying to convince men that they're the victims because they're making a lot of money off of you guys being in your victimhood. I would also say that one of the reasons why I think this is happening is because so many men, I would say not exclusively, but I do think that this is especially true with like straight white males. They feel like society has painted them as the villain. A response to that a lot of men have is to say, okay, well, if I convince people and even convince themselves that they are the victim, you don't have to be the villain. Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of these guys don't want to be portrayed as the villain. They don't want to be the bad guy. And because a lot of them are being labeled as a villain, not even necessarily because of anything that they've done specifically, but because of what maybe other men in history or other men currently are doing. I think there's a lot of men who are like, well, hey, if I convince people and myself that I am the victim, then I don't have to be seen as the villain. I don't have to be the bad guy. I'm not saying that's a positive mentality to have, but I do have sympathy for men who are using this victim mentality to not appear like you're evil, like you're the bad guy, right? And my heart goes out to guys who feel that way, because I don't think that that's healthy for men. I don't think that's healthy for women. I don't think it's healthy for anybody, because it is blocking men from truly stepping into their masculine energy. When men don't truly step into their masculine energy, they're not safe people. Like, they're not safe for themselves. They're not safe for women, for children, for the world. It's men that fall into that victimhood mentality that tend to be more dangerous men. Like, there's a kind of it's a Jordan Peterson idea. I don't know if it's originally his, but it's something that he's talked about a lot, is that men need to have a capacity for violence. They need to be dangerous, but they need to have that danger under a certain amount of control, which is really what your masculine energy does. Your masculine energy uses that danger as a way to protect and not in a way to harm people. There's a difference between a masculine man who wants to exhibit violence in order to protect, and a masculine man who just wants to hurt for his own ego and his own satisfaction. And I've talked about this in a few other videos too. And there's a female version of that too, which I'm not going to dive into. I have other videos where I talk about that a little bit more, so I'm not going to talk about that specifically here. However, a man who is sinking into his victimhood is more likely to then take any kind of dangerous quality that he has and start using it on other people, because he perceives himself as being the victim, so he should be allowed to use that violence to protect himself, even if it's just in his own mind. that maybe that needing to protect himself isn't actually a thing. I'm gonna throw this out there, and this might be controversial, but I think some of that is what some of the school shooter situations are about. I'm sure it's more complicated than that, so I'm not saying that that's the only thing, but I do think that there is something to that. When you do have a male, because most of these mass violent attacks and things like that are males. When you have a male who has the capacity for violence, but then they sink into their own victimhood, they start to feel justified in hurting other people because it's like, in their mind, it's like, well, they're protecting themselves. When in reality, they're protecting themselves from a threat that may not even actually be there. Or maybe it is, maybe it's in their mind, but them exhibiting that violence is not really the best response to that, right? I'm oversimplifying something that is much, much more complicated. I'm just inviting people to think about this from an idea that a truly aligned masculine man who has a desire to protect is not going to do something like that, because that's actually putting vulnerable people, in that particular case children, but when you have, you know, women and children who are particularly vulnerable, a masculine man is going to want to protect women and children, is not going to want to harm women and children. One of the interesting aspects to this, of the idea that men don't want to be the villains, so they make themselves into the victims, is the fact that one big commonality that I'm noticing in doing my film breakdowns, particularly my scene breakdowns on social media, is the idea that very often in most of these movies, there's a well-established, you know, hero, and there's a well-established villain. One of the things that I've learned from studying about films and the media and things like that is we used to have these westerns where you know, the good guy was in the white cowboy hat and the bad guy was in the black cowboy hat. The good guy was all good, the bad guy was all bad, and you knew who to root for. It was a very simple time period, right? Now, as films have, you know, developed over time, you get much more distinct character developments, and you start to have storylines where you start to find the villain isn't all bad. In fact, oftentimes you empathize with the villain. You get backstories of the villain. You find out how they are, how they got to be who they are. In many movies, the villain is actually the most, you know, interesting character in the movie. And you also have situations with the hero that, you know, may have more complexities to them. Sometimes you have an anti-hero, but you do see with the villain that villains in movies very often, at least in our current society, have been really kind of glorified. One thing that I find interesting is that in many of the film breakdowns that I have done, particularly ones focused on masculinity, where you have really like a healthy masculine hero and a very unhealthy or wounded masculine villain, when I do scene breakdowns where I talk about the ways that the villain is the bad guy and the hero is the good guy, it's amazing how many men I've noticed will argue in favor of the villain. And it got me thinking that if so many men are playing the victim because they don't want to be perceived as the villain, why are so many of them fighting to be the villain or be like the villain in so many of these movies? Because we've literally created a society where we put villains up on a pedestal. Now, the first place that I noticed this was actually, I did a breakdown recently of Robin Hood. It was the Russell Crowe version. And in this movie, Russell Crowe is very much obviously the hero as Robin Hood. He does go through a transformation where he really does step into his true hero quality. He fights for the people. He's got this amazing speech about fighting for the people, fighting for freedom, things like that. And he's fighting against a tyrannical king who is King John, who is very established as being this basically, you know, bratty, spoiled, rich kid with an ego on him that wants people to bow down and worship him blindly. To me, it's pretty obvious who the good guy is, who the epitome of masculinity is, and who the bad guy is, who the guy that, if you want to call it toxic masculine or, you know, wounded masculine or unhealthy masculine, toxic behavior, whatever you want to call it, like who the bad guy is. The number of people, there's men and women, but primarily men, who were like arguing with me that, you know, men as the king, like that king mentality of being a tyrannical leader should be what men do. And I was like, how do you figure that a man who's like, you need to follow me blindly and do whatever I say because I'm in charge, how you can actually justify that kind of leadership as opposed to somebody like Robin Hood, who is literally fighting for freedom, fighting for people's rights, fighting for humanity. It kind of boggled my mind that so many men were actually fighting to be like this tyrannical king. And that actually got me thinking. Now, I don't think this is a universal mentality, but there are a lot of men, apparently, particularly online, I think a lot of younger men, who think that this idea of being a tyrannical king, of, you know, I can do whatever I want and say whatever I want, like that makes you more masculine. And it really doesn't. Historically, it's never really made someone more masculine. It may have made people more powerful, but it wasn't really touted as being a masculine leader. When we think about men who have really led movements in life, men who have really done something with society, with the world, they've been fighting for something greater than themselves. It hasn't been for their own, you know, egotistical needs. Now, the ego is a human experience, and I have other videos where I talk about that more. So I'm not necessarily saying that anybody, any human, male or female, is going to be able to completely get rid of their ego. But when you have men who are leading society solely from their own ego needs, it's never going to feel safe. It's not going to feel safe for women or children. And reality, guys, the reason why you're here is to connect to your masculine energy and to protect women and children. That's literally like why we're created the way that we're created, right? But it got me thinking about some of my other film breakdowns and comparing some of the villains in these movies to some of the men that we tout as being masculine leaders. Now, our society desperately needs more healthy masculine leaders. Absolutely do. I'll be the first one to say it. I think father figures are important. Like, having healthy, present father figures is crucial. I don't think that's the only aspect. I think we need overall masculine, like healthy masculine role models in our society, teaching young boys and being a great representation of masculine energy for young girls. We desperately need that in our society for sure. And I have another video where I dive into this a little bit deeper, but one of the problems with having a lack of masculine leadership, of course, the biggest problem is the fact that we don't have young boys that are actually taught by healthy masculine leaders how to step into their true masculinity. However, when you have that lack there, it leaves a place for very unhealthy masculine leaders to step in. I've compared this in other videos before, but that's actually one of the reasons why you have a lot of boys that get involved in gangs. They're looking for brotherhood, male leadership from older people in their communities, and they get involved with gangs, which are not a healthy expression of masculinity by any means. But you get young boys who are seeking something, and when they have that lack, they often find that thing in very unhealthy ways. And I bring up Andrew Tate a lot, I know, when I talk about this kind of stuff. He is not the only one for sure, but I think he is a very, very terrible representation of masculinity. One of the keys is I don't disagree with everything that he says. Unfortunately, when I do agree with his representation of masculinity, all that gets negated by all of the dangerous and toxic things that he is doing in society, in the world. But obviously, if he never said anything that anybody agreed with, he wouldn't get popular, right? He's a prime example of manipulation, and I'm going to dive into that. But I was thinking about this whole concept and a lot of my film breakdowns, and I got to thinking about one of my favorite film breakdowns I've ever done, which I think is one of the ultimate films to talk about masculinity, and also I think femininity, because the relationship dynamic in that is one of my absolute favorites. But it's my film breakdown of 300, which I think King Leonidas is one of the ultimate representations of masculinity. And I think a lot of men would probably agree. However, when you look at that movie, when you look at the relationship between Leonidas and Xerxes, who does Xerxes remind you of? He literally is Andrew Tate. Like, I would not be surprised at all if Andrew Tate did not model his entire personality after Xerxes. I'm telling you, watch the movie, compare the two, you can't unsee it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I feel like we as a society were convinced that somebody like him, and it's not just him, but I think he had a lot of people underneath him that kind of tried to follow his model, is they kind of painted him as a Leonidas, but he's really a Xerxes. What Xerxes did in that movie was, and I highly recommend that you watch my film breakdown, and I have some like movie clips to my TikTok. I should put some on my YouTube shorts because I don't think they're there, but I will. What Xerxes did was, he believed that he was a god as a leader, which you could very much argue that Leonidas was much more connected to his divine masculine energy. Xerxes just labeled himself to be a god. What does that sound like? You label yourself to be like godlike. It gives you this like massive ego quality. He was totally caught up in his appearance. If you think about it, like in the scene where Leonidas is being like pelted with arrows, Xerxes gets a little scrape on his cheek and it's like, oh my god, my life is over. It's all about physical appearance. He has to have everything to be elaborate and over the top, gold, glamorized. Everything is about the flash. Very much Andrew Tate, right? Or those kind of guys, like that kind of mentality, that like manosphere thing where it's all about the look, the flash, the peacocking, so to speak. Whereas you have somebody like Leonidas who's basically like, he's dealing with the bare bones minimum. Like that's his masculine. He only needs to show up with his brotherhood and his courage and his focus and his drive, and that's all he needs. He doesn't need all that flash, doesn't need all that everything. Like he doesn't need all that stuff. If you think about it, Xerxes also targets the boy, or he's a man basically that was deformed in the story, that was rejected from Sparta because he couldn't physically fight. And he wanted to be a Spartan, but he couldn't physically do it, and they couldn't let him physically fight. So he ends up going off to Xerxes, and Xerxes basically lures him into this like den of sin, which is exactly what Andrew Tate's being arrested for, if you think about it, or being detained for, is essentially having this like basement full of cam girls, right? And you know, it's this like den of sin, and he lures in the weak man who wasn't accepted by the rest of society, and says that, you know, Leonidas had told him that he couldn't fight with him because he couldn't fully stand up, like he didn't have the strength to stand up. Xerxes is like, I don't demand that you stand, I only demand that you kneel. Basically what that was is like, I'm not gonna make you have to be a full man, I just ask you to worship me. In a lot of ways, if you actually look, and I highly encourage you, I'm gonna try to link a video below that actually talks a lot about the things that Andrew Tate has actually confessed to, if you're somebody who believes he's actually innocent. I found it eye-opening. I didn't believe he was innocent, but if you're questioning it, it was a fascinating video. I'm gonna try to link that below. Andrew Tate really was, I mean, yes, he was manipulating these girls into becoming cam girls and things like that and whatever, but he was also getting a lot of these men that were following these cam girls addicted to his business, addicted to the pleasures of thinking they were talking to these girls. And then these guys were actually having these like flirty sexual conversations with Andrew Tate and like his guys that worked for him. It wasn't even the women they thought they were talking to. He literally like lured in a bunch of men who were, you know, maybe insecure, didn't know how to talk to women in real life, couldn't get women in real life, so they wanted these virtual women, and lured them into this like addiction to lust to weaken them. And then he talked about how tough he was, or how tough men are, or strong men are, when he was literally weakening men as part of the process. And I'm actually going to get into that in a minute. I compare him to another villain, but if you watch Xerxes, he literally is Andrew Tate. It's like you can't unsee it once you see it, right? Not a Leonidas. Guys, seriously, be a Leonidas. Be someone who's fighting for something greater than himself. Leonidas was dedicated to his feminine partner. Why? Because she was his true partner. She was his true queen. He chose a queen who was his match, who was his person. I mean, the queen in that, I could go on and on and on about the queen in 300, because I think she's such a great representation of feminine energy, of them together as a couple. I think it's such an amazing dynamic. I'm not gonna dive into that, but Leonidas is the role model. Like, he's the one. Find a real life Leonidas, not some guy who's pretending to be a Leonidas but is actually a Xerxes. I would also, I mean, you could easily compare Andrew Tate to King John. I mean, everything about King John, if you watch my Robin Hood breakdown, and again, I'm talking about Andrew Tate because he's kind of the one that's public in the news and things like that, but at the end of the day, a lot of guys like him fall into this category where they're basically like, follow my lead, I'm the king, I'm invincible, do what I say, and not someone who's actually fighting for the people. I think there's a lot of guys out there, a lot of these like men's leaders and stuff, and there are some great ones out there, but there's also some really bad ones, and I think it's really important as a man that you figure out which ones are really gonna lead you in the right direction. Do you have a guy that's asking you to follow you blindly because he's in charge and he's actually weakening you? Or are you actually connecting yourself with a man who truly wants to empower you as a man? I mean, I just did a film breakdown of Lord of the Rings recently that I highly recommend you check out. I mean, the whole concept of that movie is really that this ring, which is this like egoic power, is destroying men. It's destroying strong men. It's destroying good men. And it's the men who actually know that there's a greater purpose out there, that there's something greater than themselves, Gandalf, Aragon, I would say Sam for sure. They know that there's a greater purpose out there and they don't get sucked into that, the egoic need for power of the ring. Those are the men that you want to aspire to. Don't aspire to the ego power. Be the man that is fighting for something greater than that. And that's the type of masculinity that you should fight for. Are you going to get labeled as a misogynist sometimes? Probably. Are you going to get labeled as, I don't know, a bad guy or toxically masculine sometimes? Probably. We're all going to get labeled something, but don't live in fear of that. If you become aligned with your true masculine self, you don't need to worry about that stuff because that stuff just isn't going to matter to you at all. And I also want to talk about a film breakdown that I just recently did, The Matrix. And I highly recommend you check that out because I'm not going to repeat everything I say in that, but there's an aspect to that too where, because Andrew Tate talks a lot about the Matrix and a lot of these like red pill guys talk about the Matrix, and when you actually watch the movie you realize like how far off these guys actually are with what the Matrix kind of is. A lot of these guys are literally fighting to just become the most powerful person in the Matrix, but they're still in the Matrix. Like they haven't actually woken up from that because they're still buying into the concept of mass consumerism. And I would actually argue that in this movie, in The Matrix, there's a couple distinctions. For one, Cypher, who ends up being the guy who sells out his friends for fame, money, and power, is the one that actually seems to resemble Andrew Tate the most. I mean, literally, like, physically resembles him, and this is long before Andrew Tate was possible, so it was not based on him. But you could easily argue that he's very similar to Andrew Tate in, like, he's a part of the Matrix, and he even knows he's part of the Matrix, but he's willing to give in and enjoy all the pleasures of the Matrix as long as he can do it with money and power, which is not really escaping the Matrix. I would also argue that too in that movie there's an important aspect where in two different occasions, in one case Neo almost gets killed because he gets distracted by an attractive woman that walks by. It just turned out to be virtual. It wasn't real, but if it was real life, he would have died because he got distracted by his animal lust. In another situation, another character actually does get killed because he's distracted by his animal lust. And somebody like Andrew Tate is literally participating in the porn industry, which is selling men porn that they are getting addicted to, which is keeping men in that addiction to their animal lust, which is literally keeping men from fully stepping into their masculine. Because a big aspect of being in your masculine is sexual discipline. It's discipline in every area. The masculine needs to have discipline, but especially sexual discipline. A woman is not going to trust a man or follow his leadership if she cannot see him as a trustable masculine partner. And he will not feel trustable and stable if he does not have sexual discipline. That's the reality. Look into all of the side effects of porn culture. I'm telling you, all of this porn that men are consuming, the cam girls paying the OnlyFans, you know, feeding into this constant obsession with, you know, Instagram models and things like that. It's literally feeding into the Matrix. Like, you have somebody like Andrew Tate who is saying that he's trying to escape the Matrix or fight the Matrix. He literally is the Matrix. Like, he is part of that because the Matrix is designed to keep men weak and distracted by their lustful animal urges. I would also say, like, other things like their, you know, pride, their, you know, obsession with egoic power, things like that. Like, that's what the Matrix is. Somebody like Andrew Tate can throw out words like the Matrix and things like that, but he literally is feeding into the Matrix. You know, again, I'm harping on him. He's not the only person that's doing that. And I know that guys are going to start arguing, well, what about the women with the OnlyFans and things like that? I have a whole video where I dive into that much deeper, so I'm not going to go into that here because I want to stay focused on this. I'm not justifying any of that. I'm not justifying women participating in this kind of, you know, lustful addictions or anything like that. I think I want to address the aspect of men. And again, watch The Matrix. You can watch my breakdown of it. I want to see men step into their true masculine energy. This is the thing that drives me crazy is, and I have conversations with men about this too, where I'll be like, hey, you know what, men, you're better than your basic biological urges. When you fully step into your masculine, like, you're all capable of being wonderful, amazing masculine leaders. I want to see men step up and be the best versions of themselves. I want to see men be better. I want to see them step into their true masculine energy. I truly want to see that for themselves, for the world, for women, for children, for everybody. Like, there's little boy energy that you see in men who basically just try to people please. It's like, I just want to make mommy happy in all their relationships. There's a lot of adolescent boy behavior that's going on with boys like, you can't tell me what to do, you can't this, whatever. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm inviting you to learn more about this stuff. I'm inviting you to find masculine leadership. I'm inviting you to find men's groups, true healthy masculine leaders. I want to see men do better. I don't ever want my content to be tearing men down. I don't want that to be what it is. I don't want to emasculate men. I literally want to emasculate them. I do. I want to inspire men to step up and be greater. I don't want to see men settle for just being like, well, this is how men are. Well, I'm just a slave to my urges. I'm just a slave to my biology. I don't want to see men be a slave. I want to see you be better. When you actually just accept that you were a slave to something, you're feeding into the matrix. You're feeding into, you know, I don't call it blue pill, call it whatever you want. You're feeding into that. I believe men can be better than that. And I want to see a world where men are truly connected to their masculinity. I want to see men be masculine. I want to see that. I absolutely do. I don't want men to start sinking into this idea that they are a slave to their biology. I don't want to see them follow leaders that really just want to use and manipulate them any more than I want to see women get used and manipulated. I don't want to see that happen to men either. I want to see men be better. I understand that there are a lot of men who are not going to listen to this message. You're either going to be staring at my cleavage, or you're going to be like, a woman doesn't know what she's talking about, or whatever. I understand that. I accept that. These were just things that were on my mind and on my heart that I really wanted to put out there and share. I hope some of this message got across. If it was just women that watched this and you learned something from this too, I'm not here to tell women to emasculate men. I don't want men to be emasculated. I want to see women hold men to a higher standard so men can reach their full potential. But I want to see men reach their full potential. I do. I don't want to see men just get dragged down and get beaten down by society. I want to see men rise up, but I want to see men rise up not out of anger and bitterness. I want to see men rise up to be the full, true masculine leaders that they have the potential to be. I want to see men be great. And I don't want you to sink into victimhood mode. I want to see you be better than that, because I know that you're capable of that. So I hope some of that got across in this message. You know, maybe watch some of the film breakdowns that I've done before. I want to see men be better, because in reality, you know, women are at their best when men are at their best. Men are at their best when women are at our best. I mean, we're just better when we're all living up to our full potential, and that's what I want to see for people. So if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up and be sure you subscribe to my channel. If you do have any thoughts on this topic or anything you would like to add to this topic, maybe leaders that you would like to recommend or things like that, movies, films, books, anything that you'd like to recommend about masculinity or anything like that, I'm always open to a respectful discussion. I would ask that you keep the discussion respectful, but you know, I'm always open to differences of opinion. If you think differently than me, that's okay too. If you are a woman watching this video and you would like to connect to your feminine energy, I do have online courses, details in the description box below, along with links to all my social media accounts. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.